So welcome to CSI, Conflict Solutions International, to our event Hong Kong on the Brink, which is a very hot topic. So our panelists, I'm Netra Halprin. I am a board member of CSI and producer-director at Peace Films and previously the host for Netra's News. So our panelists are Jeffrey Nyo, okay. And Jeffrey is an activist historian of and from Hong Kong, currently pursuing his PhD at Georgetown University. He also serves as chief researcher for Domicito, the Hong Kong-based youth political group. In 2017-18, he was a visiting scholar at the University of Toronto. Dr. Dan Garrett is an author, photographer, political scientist, and sociologist documenting Chinese security politics and securitization of Hong Kong. He has a nearly 20-year engagement with the city, is a photo contributor to HK Free Press, has briefed Congress, and is a prior career U.S. national security professional. Kevin Lin is the China Program Officer at the International Labor Rights Forum in Washington, D.C. He works on labor rights in China and has written about Chinese civil society and Hong Kong's protest movement. He also co-edits the Made in China journal with a focus on China's social and political issues. Brian Becker was going to be here, but he had a family emergency, so he couldn't make it. So we are going to give each panelist some time to give their analysis of what's happening right now in Hong Kong and especially vis-a-vis China. So would you like to go first, Kevin? Dan, yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you to Conflict Solutions for inviting me here. Thank you for the audience for coming up and my co-speakers for being here. So as Netra mentioned, I have about a 20-year engagement with Hong Kong. My first time coming to Hong Kong was in 2000. So about 3 years after the handover. However, before that, I actually watched the handover take place while I was in the emergency room at the hospital waiting for my youngest son to be born. So while I was sitting there for 6 or 7 hours, I was actually watching the handover take place. And that was my first time I became politically engaged with the issue of Hong Kong. Prior to that, when I was in the U.S. Air Force, I was stationed in Japan for 6 years. And I was in Japan when Tiananmen Square happened in 1989. So at that time, I became politically interested in China, as well as Japan studies, which I was pursuing at the time. However, to fast forward, prior U.S. national security professional in the intelligence community, Department of Defense, looking at strategic and technical threats. So nothing really political per se. I retired in 2011, and that coincided with the time I was offered a PhD position in Hong Kong at City University of Hong Kong, which I began to pursue. And my topic ended up being looking at the China-Hong Kong conflict, specifically China's securitization of Hong Kong, Hong Kongers, and one country, two systems as existential threats to the communist system. And so concurrent with that, I've always been a photographer, and I found Hong Kong visually interesting and had begun photographing the protests in Hong Kong just out of my own personal interest. But over time, as I was doing my PhD work, I found out that I could actually use visual methods and it could be part of my research methodology. So my focus on protests in Hong Kong was basically at the street level. So as of now, I've probably photographed over 700 or close to 700 protests in Hong Kong between 2011 and up to 2019 last year, when I was there for 5 weeks at the end of May to the beginning of July. So there to cover the 30th anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre and then the 1 July. And at the time, we knew that the extradition protests were beginning to percolate. But at that time, initially, when I first made my plans to go there, it just looked like many of the other protests in Hong Kong, that it was just normal contentious politics. Now, a lot of times when people think about protests in Hong Kong, they think only the pro-democracy movement. Actually, Hong Kong is much more diverse than that. There's solidarity protests with other movements around the world. There's gender protests. There's labor protests. There's all kinds of protests, anti-war protests. And I photographed many of those, and a lot of those between 2011 and 2014, prior to the beginning of the Umbrella Revolution, are in the book that was mentioned earlier. So I was there for the 5 weeks when the water revolution began. So from the end of May to the beginning of July, as I mentioned. And I was photographing. So on June 12th, which is the date that I and a lot of other people place the water revolution as beginning, and it's referred to by a lot of people as the water revolution, is because it refers to Bruce Lee saying, be water, be flexible, don't be constrained by your adversary. And it's because water is the strongest force. It can overcome anything. And so this time, 2019, as opposed to 2014, is a much more fluid protest movement. It's not an occupation of certain camps fixed, where the adversary, the Hong Kong police and the Chinese Communist Party, can come and attack you at ease. But anyway, on June 12th, I was there in that morning, and we saw the beginning of the occupation of Harcourt Road and the Hong Kong government complex. Thousands of young Hong Kongers and older Hong Kongers. Actually, it was very diverse. Teenagers to elderlies were out bringing out barricades and occupying the streets. Now, I photographed for about 5 to 6 hours that morning. I was down at the intersection between the Hong Kong government complex and the PLA Hong Kong garrison, Tim Hua Avenue. And at that time, the police were very agitated the whole time, even though the protesters were very peaceful, maybe a little bit loud and rambunctious, but there was no violence. There was no confrontational tactics. However, the police were very belligerent. You had several police officers trying to bait the protesters to come in so that they could squirt them with pepper spray. They had these huge pepper spray backpacks that allowed them to squirt the pepper spray 20 or 30 yards away. And they even did this towards the journalists. And so after 5 or 6 hours of photographing that standoff, and there were some Hong Kong pro-democracy lawmakers that came from Civic Party, Jeremy Tam, Alvin
Young.
Yes, forget his brain cramp here. And they tried to negotiate. And this has been one of the things that has been very different in 2019, 2020, from 2014, is the moderate pro-democracy camps have been trying to de-escalate the conflict between the police and the protesters. But now the police are beginning to arrest them because they're not interested in peacemaking right now. It's all about punishment. And this is what we saw on June 12th. When the police came out and attacked the protesters, it wasn't about trying to arrest protesters. It was about punishing protesters. This is why we have videos of protesters, or of police chasing down a single protester carrying a pallet of water bottles, 6 or 8 cops beating him with nightsticks. And it was these types of incidents that lots of people saw that really enraged Hong Kongers, just like in 2014. And I apologize for jumping around here a little bit, but if you want to draw some parallels between 2014 and 2019, 3 easy ones are this. Both major events transpired because of stolen elections. In 2014, it was the prospect of electing the chief executive by universal suffrage. The 831 decision by the National People's Congress Standing Committee basically said instead of Hong Kongers having universal suffrage like they have waited for 20 to 30 years, they would instead have village democracy, which is a form where the Communist Party picks 3 or 4 candidates, and you can pick for whichever candidate that you like, that the party approves of. So this was not the universal suffrage that Hong Kongers had patiently waited for many decades. In 2019, the stolen election, well, it depends if you look at 1984, there was a talk of elections, and then in 1990 with the Basic Law, universal suffrage came out, but yes, sir. So in 2019, the stolen election dates speaks back to 2016, when the Hong Kong camp, the third party in Hong Kong politics, traditionally you had pro-communist parties, or sometimes called pro-establishment, and you had the pro-democracy camp. But in 2016, you had the pro-Hong Kong camp that was voted into audience. So some of these are nativists, some of these are very pro-Hong Kong identity. Anyway, after an unprecedented win, they were purged from the Legislative Council by the NPC Standing Committee. And so basically this is seen as a second stolen election. And on July 1st, when some of the protesters stormed the Legislative Council and they occupied it and they defaced the symbols of the Chinese Communist Party, including the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region government, which myself and lots of others see as distinct from the ideal of Hong Kong. You have Hong Kong, which is the cultural, social identity, and then you have the Hong Kong SAR, which is a political identity, which is a part of the communist system. But anyway, they had talked about the reason that they had defaced the Legislative Council, invaded it, was because it was no longer Hong Kongers' Legislative Council. It had been taken away. And so this is the second stolen election. Now, the other thing is unprecedented regime violence against protesters. So in 2014, it was on September 28th, when the Hong Kong police fired, always get this back, 78, 87 canisters of tear gas and started beating the protesters to disperse them. And up to that point, Hong Kong protests, the many tens of thousands of Hong Kong protests from 1997, even before, have always been peaceful. And even when there's been some so-called violence, it's really just been some jostling, pushing and shoving at the big front of the protest line, and only by some of the so-called radicals, the more leftist groups, but no real violence. So in 2014 was this unprecedented regime violence that shocked Hong Kongers and that brought eventually over 1 million Hong Kongers out to the streets to support the Umbrella Revolution. Sometimes you'll hear referred to as Occupy Central. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but basically the Umbrella Movement, the Umbrella Revolution preempted Occupy Central. In 2019, it was the violence on June 12th when the police attacked the protesters again that also once again sparked the outrage of Hong Kongers that they came out in such numbers. So like I said, I was there for 5 or 6 hours photographing. I had to take a break. I went home to take a break, took a nap, woke up, all hell had broken loose. The police had been attacking protesters. Everything was shut down. The MTRs were being shut down. So I came back out to photograph for another 6 or 7 hours. And the temperature had changed dramatically. Now you saw Hong Kongers ready to fight back. They were so outraged at the Hong Kong police. And this is not just young Hong Kongers in the sense of 20 or 30 somethings. You saw teenagers out there. You saw as many women as men out there. You saw elderlies, 80s, 90-year-olds. And you saw, now a lot of people, when they talk about Hong Kong and Hong Kongers, they think only ethnic Chinese. But there's other nationalities and there's other ethnicities that are also Hong Kongers. You have a great number of Southeast Asians that were born and grew up in Hong Kong for generations. You have Westerners, you have Gwailos that look like me as well. And so this was united. You had people standing side by side. And this really set the precedent for the police brutality, the outrage over the police brutality over the next 8 months where we're at now. Every time the police have escalated the violence against protesters, Hong Kongers have responded. Now the majority, the near totality of the protest movement, the water revolution, is peaceful, non-violent. You have a couple thousand out of up to 2 million people that are on the front lines, bravely confronting the police violence, and not just police violence, but also what we call patriotic triads. So hired gangsters that have come out on 7/21, July 21st, to attack Hong Kongers, and also in North Point, where I lived, they came out and they attacked Hong Kongers. They didn't just attack protesters; they attacked anybody that was out at the same time. So basically, what we currently have right now is, I'll finish up real quick, is a state of de facto martial law in Hong Kong right now, where the Chinese Communist Party has not sent the PLA in, although they did increase the numbers. They have instead used the Hong Kong police force as basically the PAP, People's Armed Police, to basically use lethal force and crack down and suppress Hong Kong. Thank you.
Is question to be followed at the end?
At the end.
At the end.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
They'll ask each other
I'm
questions.
to ask him a lot of good questions that the audience will be very interested to hear. Okay. Thank you for your
Keep memory of that. Yes.
Right. I will. Okay. Thank you.
Do you want to, or should I?
Yeah, you should go.
Don't push around. Okay.
Okay. Yeah, I can go.
Okay?
Yeah, I can go. Sure,
okay.
sure. Okay. Yeah. So thanks for being here and thanks for having me today to speak about Hong Kong. I think we in 2020 now, and this is the year of the rat, and it's a lot that can change in 12 years. And I recall the last time there was the year of the rat was 2008, and 2008 was really a moment in Hong Kong when one country, two systems, the faith in one country, two systems, seemed to have reached its very highest point. I was a secondary school student at the time in Hong Kong, and the defining event that year was the Beijing Olympics. And it was a time when most Hong Kongers thought that it was a good thing that the Olympics were being held in China. And in fact, the horse racing, the equestrian games were actually hosted in the Sha Tin district in Hong Kong, which is where I live in Hong Kong. And so there was the idea that 2008, right, was the moment when being part of this one country, two systems actually worked. It was a sort of moment of pride for many Hong Kongers, and because of what China had achieved, economic progress, further integration into the world, with joining, say, the WTO, etc. And Hong Kong could share part of that by virtue of one country, two systems. And I was looking at the opinion polls recently, and in 2008, it was actually the number of Hong Kongers polled by HKU who opposed Taiwanese independence actually reached above 80%, almost close to 90%, which is very unimaginable from the vantage point of today when a clear majority of Hong Kongers actually support Taiwanese independence. And in light of the recent protests, we've seen a sort of motif at various protest sites are actually signs of Hong Kongers showing solidarity with the struggles of Tibet and of Xinjiang. And at the time, in 2008, there were massive protests against the Beijing Olympics by people who supported self-determination in Taiwan and as well as in Tibet. But at the time, Hong Kong was a very different place with a very different mindset. And these ideas were not as common, remotely as common as they were today. And really, we see that transition in just these 12 years. And actually, I would say most of it since 2012, when Xi Jinping took power as the General Secretary of the Communist Party in China. And it really sort of the politicization of Hong Kong, especially the young generation, coincided with the period of time actually when Dan was in Hong Kong, as he was just speaking about just now. In 2012, many of my friends, they formed Scholarism, including Joshua Wong, who led the group, and successfully protested against the Beijing's attempt to enact national education, patriotic education in Hong Kong public schools. And that was sort of a prelude to the kind of youth participation in Hong Kong's contentious politics, and it reaches a level that gained international attention in 2014 during the Umbrella Movement, and then numerous other protests as well between then and last year, and we've reached the point where the anti-extradition protests have evolved into something so much bigger, and it's about it's about so much more than the bill, which has now been withdrawn, and it's about so much more than Carrie Lam, the leader, but it's about fundamentally what kind of system Hong Kong should have, and what kind of relationship moving forward with the year 2047 in mind that Hong Kong should have with China. I was in Hong Kong last summer. I went back in late May, and I think pretty much like Dan, went back expecting there would be protests, but never would have imagined that it would erupt in the way that it eventually did. Initially, I had planned to stay until July, but as things were unfolding, I actually changed my flight to August so I could stay in Hong Kong for another month before returning here to Washington for school. And really, I mean, historic 2 million people marching in the streets on the 16th of June. That was really something, because prior to that, the last protest that had broken a record was actually in 1989 on May 27th, I believe, or 28th, just a couple of days before the final June 4th crackdown. So Hong Kong's sort of pro-democracy movement really had its roots in the 1980s in the aftermath of the Sino-British negotiations and in light of the Tiananmen protests. And it has evolved over the years. In 2003, obviously, 500,000 people took to the streets against Article 23, which is the national security law. I was a primary school student at the time, and that was actually my very first protest. I was a much younger kid. And with every episode where you see Hong Kongers sort of rising up in defense of our autonomy, I think more and more people are awakened. So for many people about the age of my parents, their sort of moment of political awakening would have been in the 1980s. Either in 1984 with the signing of the Joint Declaration, or with the Tiananmen protests in '89. For maybe people my age or a little older, maybe the first protest that they would have gone was 2003 or 2009 against the high-speed railway, construction of the high-speed railway, or for those about my age or a little younger, maybe the umbrella movement was their first protest. And now we're seeing, literally, 12, 13-year-old kids being arrested in Hong Kong for participating nonviolently, in most cases, the ongoing protest against the extradition bill, and that has awoken another generation. So it's that kind of process where people in Hong Kong, has transformed the city. Used to be a reputation being it was a city that didn't really care about politics. It was all about pursuing the so-called Lion Rock dream, which is prosperous, earning a lot of money and enjoying limited degrees of freedom, even without democracy. That was sort of the ethos of the colonial period, especially after World War II in Hong Kong. But now it's completely different. Now Hong Kong, events over the past 8 months or so, has really served as a model for the kind of mass protest and civic participation, how that can change policy and how that can exert real pressure, sustained pressure against a government that is unwilling to listen to the will of the people. And just to say, maybe remark a little about the very present moment. I think it has the timing has been very interesting in that there was a huge protest early in January, this January, so beginning of 2020, on January 1st actually, and then there was the landslide re-election victory of President Tsai Ing-wen in Taiwan. And it was literally the week after that that everybody in China and also in Hong Kong and most people around the world had actually learned about the outbreak of the coronavirus. So since then, for about the past month or so, there had been no mass protests in the sense that there weren't tens of thousands of people taking the streets, up to 1 million people taking the streets, as we had seen in months past. And that's because everybody is worried about the outbreak and they're trying to avoid sort of mass protests and any occasion where you would be in contact with many people. But the irony is that the decrease in the number of street protests has actually not meant or reflected a sort of approval in any way of the Hong Kong government. In fact, the Carrie Lam administration's handling of the coronavirus outbreak, often putting politics above the security and the public health of Hong Kong, has actually caused even the people, some of the people on the pro-Beijing side in Hong Kong, to be dissatisfied and actually revolting against the Hong Kong government's response. So they have managed to mismanage a political crisis last year in terms of the extradition bill, and they have managed again to mismanage the current public health crisis. And this is sort of the moment where we're at right now, and I don't know when mass numbers of people will return to the streets again. Presumably not until the coronavirus outbreak is sort of the situation is more under control. But I think there is some parallel really to see with 2003 as well, when there was SARS. It was a sort of a combination of a public health crisis and a political crisis, which in 2003 was the case of SARS and Article 23, as I said earlier, that caused massive uproar, causing half a million people to take to the streets, eventually forcing the stepping down of Tong Chee-hwa, who was the first chief executive in Hong Kong, and two high-profile resignations in the cabinet. That seems less likely now in light of Xi Jinping's sort of hardline rule. But at the end of the day, I think there are parallels that we can draw from 2003 moving forward, and we'll see how it goes.
Wonderful.
Kevin Lin?
Sure. Yeah, I think both Dan and Jeffrey gave a really comprehensive overview of the movement from the early 2000s until now. So I will focus more on the labor issue. I primarily work on labor rights issues in mainland China. And in my line of work, we have allies in Hong Kong, labor rights organizations in Hong Kong who have been supporting labor movement in China. It's no secret to all of us that Hong Kong's civil society, Hong Kong's social movements have played a really important role in supporting social movements in mainland China, cross-border, which is actually one of the reasons civil society and really grew dramatically in the last 20 years in mainland China, in large part, due in no small part to the support from Hong Kong. So I want to sort of acknowledge that role. So I want to focus a little bit on labor. I think when you look at the 1 million, 2 million demonstrations in Hong Kong last year, you do wonder who are the protesters. It's pretty much everyone, but a lot of them are obviously workers, employees across all sectors. But the question becomes, why was labor union not a major force in the movement? Again, it's not surprising that in fact the union movement in Hong Kong has been pretty weak for the last 30 years or so. So there are two union federations in Hong Kong. One is aligned with the government. It's the Hong Kong Co-Federation of Trade Unions, and there's an independent trade union federation called Hong Kong Federation of Trade Union. Oh, sorry, it's the other way around, actually. The independent is the Hong Kong CTU, Hong Kong Confederation of Trade Unions. So both union movement actually has been pretty weak for different reasons. The unionization rate in Hong Kong is actually not low by international standard, but workplace power and and sort of workplace-based mobilization actually has not been very strong in Hong Kong. So when the movement erupted last year, even though workers and employees joined the movement in massive numbers, they did not join as a unified force. As union members, they were participating in the movement as individuals. It did change finally toward the end of last year, when I think within the movement there are divergent strategies emerging. One of the strategy is unionizing. So we have seen since late last year, October, November, December, there's been a massive effort to unionize workers. We have seen the massive growth of membership just in the last 2 or 3 months, which is extremely impressive. Again, Hong Kong is now known as a place where there is a huge union movement. It's now known for protection of labor rights. But we have seen this massive unionizing movement. And most recently, we see a massive strike by the medical workers around the issue of coronavirus, actually. Their main demands are essentially adequate protection for their conditions and adequate supplies of protective gears, as well as actually closing the border with China in order to quarantine, in order to sort of stop the flow of people and the spread of virus from mainland China to Hong Kong. It did actually, it was kind of contentious. I think we can go into it if we want later on. But we have to acknowledge the impressive sort of unionizing effort in the Hong Kong protest movement. So why is this a massive unionizing effort in Hong Kong? So there has been, there are multiple tactics used by the protest movement. So that includes, street protest, mass demonstration, class boycott. But there's another one, which is strike. Hong Kong protesters talk about general strike many times, and it's not just started this time. In 2014, during the umbrella movement, there was also talk of general strike. There was a big general strike actually in last August, where hundreds of thousands of workers participated. But it's still, its mobilization, its power comes not so much from its mobilization, it's more coming from disruption. So airport workers, transport workers, unions, they were able to join the strike, and they successfully disrupted transportation. And that created paralyzing effect on Hong Kong. But it's not due primarily to the mobilization of workers. So I think the movement, and at least some section of the movement, recognize to go forward, we need to, and to be able to organize general strike, we need to organize unions. We need to have massive unions with a lot of membership, willing to push for both economic and also political demands. Hence, there is this massive unionizing effort. I think it's also important because it's the sort of unionized effort really brings to the fore the social and economic demands. There's always a question for the last 6-8 months with this question of what are the protesters' demands, and it's mostly around political issues. And I think as leftists, we always want to see more social and economic demands, especially we all know that Hong Kong is a very unequal society. Poverty level is pretty high, and it's going up. So and housing is a big issue as well. So how do we address this issue? I think it's both a political issue in the sense that universal suffrage will help to sort of give ordinary people, a greater voice in politics. But it's also a workplace issue in that to have the right to bargain with your employers, bargain over wages, that is really, really important in improving your sort of economic and social conditions. So I think that for us, that's an encouraging sign. There are increasingly social and economic demands in the movement. We are still at a very early stage of unionizing, so we'll see how it develops over time. But I think that's at least an encouraging sign. I want to end on this question of solidarity. So I am from mainland China, but I stand with the protesters, in solidarity with the protesters. I think they are obviously very diverse movements. When you have 1 to 2 million people or more on the street, it's very diverse. People hold different political opinions, and I think that's just how things are in any mass movement, not just in Hong Kong, but anywhere. So how for us, for me, I think the question is, how do we build solidarities, both at 2 levels, both as people who are based in the US, how do we provide solidarity with the Hong Kong protesters, but also I'm interested in the question of cross-border solidarity between Hong Kongers and mainland Chinese. And it's not easy because there's been massive repression in mainland China in the last few years against social movement activists, civil society. So it's not easy for people in the mainland to express solidarity. There have always been efforts by individuals in mainland China to show solidarity, but many were picked up. They were questioned and detained by police for just merely posting a photo of themselves holding a sign, to show solidarity with Hong Kong protesters. So it's been hard, but despite that, there were individuals trying to forge that solidarity. I think the same, on the Hong Kong side, I think there are protesters who have expressed solidarity with movement and protesting in mainland China. The interesting example is last year there was a environmental protest in Wuhan. That's way before the coronavirus, but there was an environmental protest in Wuhan where there's a massive street protest against a factory that people think are going to be polluting the city. And there are, sort of solidarity protests organized in Hong Kong in support of that movement, that environmental protest in mainland China. So I think that's very helpful. I think instead of dividing people up between Hong Kongers and mainland Chinese, I think it's really important to bring like progressive people in both places together. I think they're never exactly divided. As I said, a lot of the civil society and social movement activists had a lot of links with Hong Kong activists. It's been at least 20, 30 years. And I think we should strengthen those links rather than try to divide up. As Hong Kong against mainland China. I think people in both countries have
Hong Kong is not a country.
both Hong Kong and mainland China should sort of address their social and political economic issues. But I think the problem is not each other. It's their government, it's capital, it's their employers. And I think forging that solidarity, I think, will ensure both, I think, the Hong Kong movement to go forward, and also it's going to help strengthen movement in mainland China. So I think that the medical workers strike that I mentioned, I think could be something that could be encouraging, because medical workers in both mainland and Hong Kong are facing similar kind of conditions. They're working very long hours. They don't have the protection that they need to do their job, and they also don't, obviously the condition in mainland China is worse because there's no union for medical workers in most cases. So how do you sort of try to forge solidarity on the basis of shared interests and also shared challenges? I think that's something that I'm really interested in helping to build. I'm here.
Thank you. Very educational.
So do any of you have questions of the other, or questioning what the other was saying, or seeing it in a different way, or?
I would like to ask Kevin a question. Looking at how the Chinese Communist Party and the Hong Kong SCR government have responded to the strikes in Hong Kong, specifically the one in August, and then also the medical workers one. It seems that they respond much more strongly to those types of industrial actions than they do to some of the street actions, which are arguably much more confrontational towards the sovereignty of the Communist Party. And do you think that is related to the party's mandate that the prosperity and stability, mainly the prosperity of Hong Kong, must be maintained?
That's a good question. I think, I think people on all sides, recognize the power of general strikes, because the power to interrupt, economic functioning of the city. So I think it's always seen as a big threat, both in Hong Kong and also obviously in mainland China. So I should mention, there have been, over the last 15, 20 years, it's been massive number of workers' protests and strikes in mainland China. It sort of averages several thousand a year. And there has been recent serious repression against labor activists in mainland China. I think in part because of the economic slowdown. China is still growing, but the rate at which China is growing is much slower since the early 2010s. So I think there's a concern that strikes are going to be get more and more serious because of the economic downturn. So I think it's both concerns, more in mainland China, but it will be obviously in Hong Kong. I think street protests are obviously very disruptive, but economic, but it sort of incurs less direct economic costs than strikes. So I think I wouldn't say which is more threat to the government, but I certainly see general strike and strike actions in general as the most disruptive and more effective weapon. I wouldn't say more than street protests, but at least equally.
It's another type.
It's another type that could be combined and certainly not mutually exclusive.
And then I have a question for Jeffrey, if I can.
Yeah, sure.
See if I can remember. I just begin to lose it. So you mentioned, I believe, Joshua Wong and a number of others have become political prisoners in Hong Kong, especially with the arrest and the conviction of the Occupy 9. And this was kind of the background of the anti-extradition movement. Is, we had the conviction, the sentencing the Occupy 9. We had the book publishers that were kidnapped. We had the banning Hong Kong National Party, banning especially from Demo Sisto, Agnes Chow, not allowed to stand for election. These are unprecedented movements in the history of the Hong Kong SAR. And now we also have a number of Hong Kongers in the movement that have fled Hong Kong for political refuge, either in Taiwan, in Germany, and other places. With that background and with the emergence of the so-called Hong Konger not Chinese ethnicity, that's the strength of a Hong Kong nation, do you see in the future that because of the crackdown from the Communist Party and the SAR government in Hong Kong, that the movement may be forced, the Hong Kong nation, you may end up having a situation where you have Hong Kong people, much like how the Palestinians were at one time, to be a stateless person, to be a stateless people, a Hong Kong nation in exile?
There's no direct PLA intervention yet. Now, there's considerable evidence and I think fair speculation that there's infiltration either by the Chinese cops, anti-riot cops, or maybe even the PLA infiltrating the Hong Kong police and disguised as Hong Kong police in order to crack down against the protesters. But I think Beijing has restrained itself from a direct, military intervention in Hong Kong, or contemplating doing anything in Hong Kong like what they're doing in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs. I think number one is because of just how much attention Hong Kong, by virtue of being an international city, is getting. Literally, if there's something big that happens, all of us on our iPhones will get a push notification from CNN or Wall Street Journal about the latest. It's that kind of place, and Beijing recognizes that. So they will refrain themselves from doing that for that reason. And secondly, it's just how important Hong Kong is, despite Beijing's effort to undermine that image. How important Hong Kong is financially and economically to China.
I know in the U.S. Congress there's been several bills about Hong Kong, basically protecting protesters. What do you all think about U.S. response in any type of U.S. response has been to the situation? And yeah, what do you feel about it?
I can go. Yeah. Certainly it's been very helpful. And in fact, sort of late October and throughout November last year, I would say we're sort of like the climax of the movement before subsequently the coronavirus has sort of put things on hold. And that's obviously because, say, the district council elections in Hong Kong, where the opposition camp won something like 85% of the total number of seats. And then there was the siege of two universities, the Polytechnic University, the Chinese University. But on the sort of international level, what really made November momentous was the passage of the two pieces of legislation. And it's the passage of any legislation in the U.S. Congress related to Hong Kong since 1992. So it's really significant, and Dan has been an important part of that effort as well, having testified in Congress back in September, along with others, Denise Ho, Joshua Wong, etc. And so I think Hong Kongers are very conscious about the cosmopolitan nature of our city, to begin with, and we are also very conscious about the fact that we alone will have no way to stand up against the great power that is China. And so I think there's, much more so than many other sort of social movements that I've seen in the contemporary world. I think Hong Kong's movements have this sort of very conscious idea that we have to appeal to the broader international community in order to have any chance of winning allies, and as a result, gain more leverage against China, because we see that without that kind of leverage, as is the case with Xinjiang, when there's not a lot of attention and a lot of information about what's going on, then against the Chinese government alone, the repression is very severe. So I think those pieces of legislation have been very important, and I think Hong Kong's ongoing movement of resistance have in fact entered into the political discourse of the U.S. In multiple democratic presidential debates, the hosts have asked questions related to China or specifically pointing to Hong Kong, and every single candidate has in one way or another responded to the situation in Hong Kong. And I don't think Hong Kong has ever figured so importantly as a foreign policy matter, both in the Congress and at the level of presidential elections since the 90s. And it continues to be very important, along with obviously issues with Xinjiang, with Tibet, and also with Taiwan. So in the foreseeable future, I see that trend continue, and I think having the international community keep an eye on Hong Kong is the most crucial factor to sustaining the movement in the long run.
I would say that Hong Kong occupies this very special place between East and West, to use that cliche. When Deng Xiaoping and the CCP were conceptualizing applying one country, two systems in Hong Kong, China was coming out of its Cultural Revolution, the 10 years that devastated the country economically. Deng Xiaoping had the idea of opening up and reform. 1978, they started looking at. And if you go back and look through the Chinese discourses, more so than the British discourses actually, but the Chinese were already conceptualizing how they would use Hong Kong as an engine to drive socialist modernization, to drive the China, what would later become the China Dream. At that time and point, one of the important conclusions that Deng Xiaoping had made was that in order for China to rise back up, it had to have a peaceful international environment. And at that time, the recovery of British colonial Hong Kong being handed over to communist China. Once again, with the Cultural Revolution fresh in the world's mind, in the height of the Cold War, arguably, there was lots of concerns about this, even among the communists, that perhaps the West would not allow this to happen, that perhaps Hong Kongers, most of whom had fled the Chinese Communist Party in one shape or form. Now, Hong Kong has always been very patriotic in the sense of supporting the country, but Hong Kong has always been considered a base of subversion or base of revolution. From Sun Yat-sen's time against the Taiping, to the Taiping Rebellion, and the overthrow of the Chinese Qing Empire. The Communist Party even used it in its war against the KMT and its war against the Japanese. So the Communist Party has a certain concept of how Hong Kong can be used. But getting back to my point is, one country, two systems was originally supposed to be a confidence-building mechanism for Hong Kongers not to have disturbances, not to flee the colony, not to have a brain drain, not have the capital flight, but also for the international community, so that the UK, the US, and perhaps the rest of the free world would not try to obstruct or undercut the role that Hong Kong could play in China's socialist modernization. So now, fast forward 3 decades to Xi Jinping in 2012. And as Jeffrey mentioned, 2008 is where we do see a change in the aggression, arguably belligerence in some party members, China's posture, seeing that the West was collapsing and that the socialist system was rising. And so they become much more strident in thinking that Hong Kong, we don't need one country, two systems anymore. We can start cracking it down. It's actually not working for us the way that we need it. Because China, as Kevin mentioned earlier, China is in a massive transformation of its economy. It's going from a low-end factory of the world to an innovation-based society. And companies had already been leaving China before the Umbrella Revolution or before the Water Revolution because it was too expensive to work in Guangdong and so forth. But the ideal is that now is that the West is not strong enough to stand up to China over Hong Kong. The ideal is that Hong Kongers won't stand up to the Communist Party, won't stand up to the Hong Kong government. And this was a mistaken understanding from the Communist Party's perspective. And this is probably one of the two biggest areas, misjudgment that the Chinese Communist Party's advisors in Hong Kong to Beijing made, is one, that Hong Kongers would just accept the ending of one country, two systems, mainly the two systems. And this was the social contract that the Communist Party and Deng Xiaoping made with Hong Kongers. You will maintain the Hong Kong system for 50 years. The communist system will not be introduced until 2047. There'll be a minimal amount of change in the legal and political system, but largely...
That is a good sign. None of us have any opportunity to ask you questions.
I will finish it real quick, sir.
Not keep talking and listening to yourself.
Yes.
Okay?
Don't worry, you'll get time.
Yes. So they so now that things have changed, and China feels it has a strong hand, and the West has a weak hand, and now Hong Kongers have a weaker hand. But the last 8 months has shown that this is not the case. And this is one of the things I will say, my last comment. Is in 2014, Hong Kongers lost their fear of the Hong Kong police. In 2016, during the Mongkok riot, or the fishball revolution, as some people referred to it, some Hong Kongers learned that they can fight back against the Hong Kong police. In 2019, in the water revolution, Hong Kongers are standing up and they are resisting. And what you have right now is a resistance movement. You also have a protest movement. It's very complex. There's many actors and positions in it, but you have a resistance movement. And the fight right now in Hong Kong is to save Hong Kong and the Hong Kong way of life and its freedoms.
Can I ask, I want to ask you, Kevin, a question specifically. In the U.S. presidential election, socialism versus capitalism has become a thing. You mentioned how capitalism is what the problem is regarding workers and workers' rights. And obviously, many people here have mentioned the problems of communism. Communism and socialism are not the same thing, but can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I mean, obviously, I and many people that I work with don't consider China communist. It has turned capitalist decades ago. So I think that's why both in Hong Kong and in mainland China, I think the problem is both government, it's both state and also capital. I think the inequality, which is both very sharp in Hong Kong and in mainland China, housing crisis especially for young people, affordability is very, very similar in mainland China, in Hong Kong. And a lot of the frustration that young people felt are also very similar. There are obviously different context, different history, different political developments, but I think there are much more in common with young people in Hong Kong and in mainland China than people sometimes acknowledge or recognize. So I think it's definitely not a fight between capitalism and communism, because China is not a communist, has not been it's been a capitalist society at least since the late 70s, early 80s. Not even going back to the Maoist period. But I do want to just use 30 seconds to talk a bit about the legislation. I would just say one thing. I think I would say there's a risk that Hong Kong be caught in between U.S. and China. There's definitely obviously a kind of tension between U.S. and mainland China, and I think I think there's concern that Hong Kong could be caught in between. So I think that's where there should be a lot of cautions in terms of how Hong Kong movement relates to both the U.S. and China, because I think there are risks that Hong Kong could be sacrificed within this sort of great power rivalry.
Okay, so we're going to open it up to the audience. You seemed very
I'm gonna yield
keen.
to all my colleagues and guests of yours because they are my friend, okay? Obviously, I thought this would be a balanced discussion. This is truly a one-sided situation. You got Conflict Solution International, but we do not have an opposing view. So they're all generic. So I'd like to hear from the audience what they want to say.
We
okay?
did actually have Brian Becker, who would have argued on the side of China, but he canceled.
All right, maybe he canceled because it's 3 against 1, okay? So that's all right. Go ahead, sir.
All right, what exactly happens in 2047?
So right now, 2047 is the legal deadline for when Hong Kong is allowed to maintain its separate system, political, cultural, economic. It remains to be seen what will actually happen. The Communist Party has held out this carrot that one country, two systems can continue past 2047 if everything works to their satisfaction. Deng Xiaoping said the same thing. I believe if the quote was right, it may go 100 years if necessary. But the thing is that one country, two systems has not worked out how the Communist Party envisioned it, which is why it's now talking about having to change to correct how the implementation of one country, two systems is being done and also how it's understood. So this is really what has made the fear about 2047, is that we may not even get to 2047. We may not even get to 2025, because the extradition law was basically an attempt to impose mainland political and legal norms on Hong Kongers. And it would have allowed the extradition from Hong Kong of individuals from anywhere around the world that broke Chinese law. So if you're here in DC calling for the end of one-party rule, and you happen to transit Hong Kong, and the party for some reason or another wants you, they can say you broke Chinese law. Hong Kong government, give me that person. Now the Hong Kong government said that they had put protections in the draft extradition law to prohibit political transfers. But the problem is, underneath the basic law, which is the legal codification of the one country, two systems policy, the powers of national security or defense are solely reserved for the mainland. So if Beijing says this is a national security matter, much as they were talking about like the book publishers, the Hong Kong government will not and cannot refuse to hand you over. So this is the concern about 2047, is we have to get around the corner before we have to worry about that.
Well, Beijing, it seems to me that if Xi Jinping is still alive, he's going to go as far as he can to repress personal freedom. Like he's going to try to get rid of a habeas corpus, the right to be represented by an attorney, any kind of right to dissent.
Well, they can't lock up everybody.
He's a dictator.
Well, yes, they're a dictator.
He wants to have complete control. He doesn't want to risk having any, dissenting voices.
The ideal is that they want to have nice, compliant, apolitical Hong Kongers who will fuel the engine for China's growth.
Yeah, basically.
Sir.
Just a couple quick questions. One is, what type of democracy or representation was prior to 1997, underneath colonial rule? Were you able to elect a cabinet? Were there elections at all? What was the situation? It sounded like there was protests back during that time, during colonial rule as well, correct?
Okay, so just to respond, the short answer is not a lot. You're right. Under a system of colonialism, there has not been much democratic representation in Hong Kong, and which is why Hong Kongers, when we fight for our rights, we look forward but not backward.
And also, if you look like at the National Archive, the British National Archives, now the British colonials had their own interests in not introducing greater representation. Although there were times that they did, like after World War II, after the Japanese were kicked out of Hong Kong and Hong Kong was recovered, there was an effort to try to introduce greater representative governance. China threatened basically to invade every time that a greater representative government for Hong Kong was proposed, because it would be akin to independence. And this is one of the things that the Communist Party views democracy as a threat.
But at the time, the British were controlling Hong Kong.
Yes,
Yes.
under constant threat of CCP invasion.
But we know how the British controlled all their colonies.
Yes, but the CCP were on their border. Now, as we got past after the 1984 Sino-British Joint Declaration and the Basic Law in 1990, and we get into transition. So there was a 13-year transition period, and this is where the movement towards greater representation representative government took off. Actually, the last few years before 1997, there was greater representative government. There was a legislature that was totally elected. What happened on 1 July 1997, the CCP dismissed them. They purged. That was the first purge of the Hong Kong SAR legislature. And then they stuck in what we call a provisional legislature, hand-picked officials or representatives.
Another quick question on this was regarding the protests, the most recent one, and maybe earlier ones too. My understanding is the airport even closed. I mean, basically you shut down business, and Hong Kong is all about business. And it seems like these latest protests were very disruptive to business. I mean, if I was a business owner, I'd be very upset. So I would think you probably had, maybe not, maybe the business owners were okay with the protests. I'm sure perhaps they were. So what kind of, what is the thought patterns and there must be, between Hong Kongers, there must be some type of differences of perspectives as well on the strikes and how they should occur in the protests.
One of you could answer.
Do you have a? Okay,
I
I could
can go
answer.
second, yeah.
Well, business is a very broad brush, of course, and you're certainly right. There are conflicting interests within Hong Kong, and we've seen leaders of the business communities both have spoken up against the protests and in support of the protests. And I think one interesting thing that has come out of that is the rise of the so-called yellow economic circle. What that means is that people have identified, say, which restaurant has an owner who is openly supportive of the protests. And the protesters actually form an alternative economy around supporting the businesses that in turn support the Hong Kong protests and boycotting the businesses that have spoken out against the protests. So that kind of thing has been happening, and there are, Hong Kong people are very innovative and very quick and efficient. There are like apps that you can actually download right now in Hong Kong and say, oh, I'm in this area, which restaurant should I go, right? Which coffee shop should I go? And increasingly, that has shaped the economic behavior of Hong Kong. And I think the problem has been that, in the last, decade or so, that the economy has skewed so much toward trying to win over Chinese customers, for instance. And so Hong Kong people think then that the movement is about structural change in Hong Kong and to reclaim a sort of economy that actually works for the people of Hong Kong is consistent with the political belief. And so these things are all tied, and it's not very easy to unpack, but that's sort of my concise response.
The last one here too is
Can-
the other. Just one short here. The other aspect is, I've seen photographs of diplomats from certain countries, like here, talking to protest leaders and actually appears to be more promoting some of the demonstrations and stuff. So what kind of perspective is there amongst the Hong Kong, or probably there's both sides, but about the U.S. actually being involved in promoting some of the demonstrations and actually helping guide protest leaders on the conduct?
No, it's fine. Yeah.
I can
I could go.
We can tag team.
Yeah, you can go first.
Oh, okay. Yes, those photographs, and we've probably seen the same photographs, are photographs of meetings with public meetings in restaurants. So obviously nothing secret about them, nothing covert or clandestine. Second, the popular assertion that Hong Kongers need the UK or the US or anybody else to teach them how to protest. I mean, in my book on Hong Kong protest culture that was published in right before the Umbrella Revolution, so at the end of 2014, at that time point, there had already been over 50,000 public order events from 1997 to about the middle of 2014, and several tens of thousands. Hong Kongers know how to protest. Hong Kongers know their rights, and they come out from 2003, 500,000 people or so. At the same time, the Communist Party is very active through the mass line United Front organizations in Hong Kong and pushing the pro-Beijing trade unions, the Federation of Trade Unions, and other groups to come out and mobilize. And so we've seen these conflicts, yes. But Hong Kong is supposed to be an international world city. It's not communist China. It's open.
I want to follow up with your inquiry at which the panelists might try to jump over it. You paint a very nice picture about the protester, okay? However, all right, they destroyed HSBC, okay? They destroyed all the Starbucks. They said the owners' assembly happened to be aligned with someone else, okay, that which is not to your liking. And also you mentioned about the Hong Kong people know how to protest, all right? The photograph that you take, I like to see them, okay? If you take it only one side or both sides, all right? Before you speak, I know when you are biased, it's nothing I can say or do to penetrate your prejudice, okay? Sir, your question is very valid about what you see about why are they doing things that which other country that who protest or they have gripe, okay, would not do. All right. Then since you give me the floor now, my follow-up question is, you keep complaining about the Hong Kong police being brutal and so on. Have they killed any protester, not the innocent bystander or somebody want to clean the street or somebody just have a different opinion? You name one person that has been killed, not fake news, okay? Not the 6 people that they all gathering around with flour and all that.
Not
okay?
Global Times, not China Daily.
Huh?
You said no fake news, so not China
Right.
Time,
Hold on.
Global
Just
Times or
one
China
moment,
Daily.
Okay, you are also biased, so therefore you are one-sided. You can, 3 of you cannot be believed. You're supposed to deliver the real picture to this group. Okay, all right. Now, yes, everybody wants CCP dead. Okay, if they're gonna hand you the key tomorrow, what you gonna do with Hong Kong? Why Macau are not having any problem like Hong Kong? Because they observe the basic law. You have a basic law that established in 1997, July 1, when Prince Charles, okay, sailed away from Hong Kong harbor. He said, we came by sea, okay, in 1841, therefore we will leave by sea. So it's a gesture, okay, to show the honorable United Kingdom government that handed back over to China. All right, so I see you smiling, okay? Look, all the things that you delivered to this group and this audience are all one-sided. You're painting a pretty good picture to try to indoctrinate people that may not have stepped foot in Hong Kong or actually know the real-time basis. I gotta say, you guys, the biased people or the people on the what you call a one China dead or the China hater, okay? You done an excellent job, okay, on your PR, on your BS, okay, and everything else. And that's all I'm gonna have to say. Can you produce some of your picture, show how the police been very brutal, all right? Can you answer the question why Macau, all right, which is an easier managed city, has the same 2 system, 1 country, okay?
But they don't. Macau does not have the
You
same
no,
one country, two systems.
I'm not going to.
Am I allowed to?
I'm not going to argue with you because there's nobody here to repudiate.
Would you like to see, if you want to make a speech?
Well,
Would you like to see?
Why does China want to extradite people that are arrested in Hong Kong?
No, China do not want to extradite anyone. It's the Hong Kong person who run the show. Her name is Miss Lam. All right, have learned that there's a person that committed crime in Taiwan, killed his girlfriend. All right, and come back to Hong Kong and or extradite him back to Hong Kong, okay? And that is where the whole thing comes from. The extradition is happen to in anywhere. United States has extradition with every country. If the criminal commit crime in their soil, they can be extradited.
But
okay?
I think that's the root of the problem, that there's no habeas corpus, there's no right to representation in mainland China.
And I will be very, I will respond very quickly.
The Hong Kong has a basic law that you can read a copy. It's very specific and it spells out everything. And the communist China, or what you call it, Red China, or whatever you want to label China today, which is not what it is 70 years ago and so on. Okay.
That's true.
But however, thank you. All right, you can read that basic law to the last page. Get the most brilliant scholar or legalist, they read that basic. China had not changed one sentence or one period on that basic law.
They changed the meaning, the content of the words.
I'm not going to repudiate with you because that is your argument. Okay.
There are three forms of one country, two systems. Hong Kong was the first one that was implemented. It has the middle system. Macau was the second system that was implemented. It has the most regressive, most repressive system. The most lenient system is the system that was supposed to be for Taiwan. So this is the reason that Macau has a different system. It's because it's regressive. Also, Macau has the national security law
Taiwan
passed.
happened to be freed from China in 1949. And Chinese simply not going to create a World War III and leave Taiwan alone as long as they don't declare independency and will not call it a Republic of Taiwan. All right? So let me, look, I know you are already been brainwashed, okay,
Yes.
and what have you, okay? I'm not going to argue with people who already been brainwashed.
You know
okay?
my
All right?
affiliation. What is your affiliation,
My
sir?
affiliation, I am a boy that came as an immigrant.
And your name?
Hold on. I grew
And your
up.
name?
I
A
grew
boy?
Up, I grew up in Washington, D.C., okay? My school music teacher happened to be Roberta Flack. My tennis coach happened to be Robert Johnson, who coached Arthur Ashe, okay? And I only got a high school diploma.
That's okay. But what's your name?
My name is Ewan, okay?
Okay.
So I got your card.
So now you have my
right.
card.
So thank you. So if you,
All
there's
right,
going to
I will
be
keep
reception
quiet.
and you
if
can.
anyone want to learn about Hong
you
Kong
can chat
in a real
with them.
fashion, please ask me, okay? Do not let these people
Yeah, we're going to have a
okay,
reception.
all right? And I will be as friendly and as open. You can question me like you question them, okay? All
Okay,
right?
thank you.
They are smiling because they have an agenda. This young man
Okay,
from Hong Kong
that's
has
okay,
an agenda.
that's enough.
He has
Thank
an
you, sir.
agenda.
This gentleman
thank
can
you.
speak. We'll have another session. He'll address the...
Right, and just to give you the full information, just let me speak. We invited Brian Becker, who would have argued for China. We invited Michelle Greenstein, who works at RT. She couldn't get her boss's permission, and Brian Becker canceled at the last minute. So I agree with you. I would have liked to had more viewpoints, but they didn't come. I couldn't force them. I agree we should have all sides.
I appreciate it. I thought I was running into a lion stand, but you let me speak, and I appreciate it.
Okay.
Conflict Solution International, you should be balanced, okay? Not let this three people
I
try
can't
to
force
run, okay?
people
All
to
right.
come. I invited and called many
He tried
times.
to balance it, but...
I understand. I understand English, sir, okay?
Okay.
All right.
So I
Anyway,
know,
so
I
thank
know
you.
the explanation.
So thank you very much. Thank you very much.
He has balanced things in the
Excuse
past.
me,
You
sir.
would be
Thank you very much.
surprised.
So thank you everyone for coming. And we do appreciate different points of view. That's why we do our best to get every single different point of view. But again, we can't literally force people to come. So I hope you've enjoyed yourself. I hope you have learned things. You are all invited to a reception, and we're having that next door so the conversation can continue. Talk to chat with people and learn more.